Hello and welcome. This is Lita Downs from the Center for Faculty Excellence, and I would like to welcome you to today's session, Dare to Let Work Be Beautiful. This session was originally presented at the National Faculty Meeting in Tampa, Florida, back in January 2019. Our presenter, Dr. Marcia Dawkins, was there in Tampa to present. She's also presented this session as a live webinar, and she's here today to record this session for all of you. At this point, I am going to turn things over to Dr. Dawkins. Welcome. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here again. I'm really excited to share this information and some of the valuable feedback I've gained from our colleagues, both in Tampa and on the live webinar that we did a little while ago. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. Thank you for being here. And I'd like to start by getting you to know me and getting to know you hopefully through some of the questions that we'll be asking today. So my name is Marcia Dawkins, and this is a picture of me during the beginning of my professional career when I just had earned my PhD. I had my first job on the tenure track. I had my first book contract, my first fellowship in the Ivy League for research, and as fate would have it, my first real health challenge in life, which came in the form of a cancer diagnosis. And so it was during this season of firsts that I began to really think about what I wanted from my career, what I wanted from my work, what I wanted from my life and from my health, and to really ask myself some important questions. And so what I'll share today are those questions, some of the answers that I've found, and a new shift in that perspective, which I'm calling Dare to Let Work Be Beautiful, that I hope will be as helpful and insightful for you as it has been for me. Next slide. So here's how that's going to look. I'll continue introducing myself professionally and personally. Then I will go into the definitions that already exist about professional wellness. I will tell you more about my and my colleague, Dr. Kimberly Stevens' perspective on this, which we're calling beautiful work. We'll then talk about challenges to beautiful work. And then finally, together, do some reflection and think about our own new paradigms and how we can all dare to let work be beautiful. Next slide. So I've told you a bit about myself and this turning point that happened for me. And what I'll share with you now is how that has evolved for me professionally. And so it comes down to this question, really. Did you ever wonder if your professional life could be different? And when I've presented this everywhere, people take a moment and inevitably say, yes. So then the question becomes, different how and under what circumstances? What are the circumstances that would make our professional lives as well as they can possibly be? Well, let's take a look. Next slide. In the interest of fun, I want us to think about this, right? So I teach many things in communication theory. One of them is social media. And so I saw this meme, and I thought it exactly describes my journey looking for beautiful work, stopping off on every floor in my university saying, is it here? Is it there? And what I realized in this approach was that it was okay not to have the answer because there are no wrong answers. That it was okay to not worry about the what if, and that it was okay to have a bit of fun. And that is the spirit with which I talk to you today and am sharing this, what I hope will be insightful information. Next slide. So here is a question, and I'd like you to press pause at this moment and think about how you define professional wellness for yourself. Next slide. Now that you've defined professional wellness, let's talk about the question a little more broadly, and I'll share what other respondents to this question have said. So one way of thinking about this is that wellness is what makes us healthy, productive, and successful in our work. And there are all the answers that you've come up with. There are additional answers that I will share with you shortly. But there are also these structural concerns. So I share with you here from the Pew Research Center from 2016 the knowledge and skills that Americans believe will make the most difference to their wellness, professionally speaking. And these are social dexterity, knowledge of computer, communication skills, and access to training such as what we're doing here today. So again, all of these are important and very general. But what we're looking for today is to see what holes we can fill, both personally with what we may feel the adjustments and circumstances that we need to find for our own professional wellness, and then thinking about the health of our organizations and our societies as well in terms of what adjustments can be made there. Next slide. In that vein, we do need to think about the more there. And the more there are the structural concerns that prevent us from reaching our goals that we've set out for ourselves. Now, many of our obstacles can be internal, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But at the moment, I want us to think big picture here and think about what are some of the external obstacles that we might face. And again, the Pew Research Center points us in some directions. One is that there are wide gender and partisan gaps in views on women in leadership. So while my comments today are absolutely for women and men and all of us who identify that way and in other ways, what I'm getting at here is the idea that there are structures out there that can get in the way. And so we need to be able to articulate those structures, know them when we see them, and then begin to think how we can work through and in some cases around them. Next slide. And that is where the definitions, traditionally speaking, of professional wellness come into play. Now, this is more than an area of research. It's also an $11 billion industry in 2019. But having said that, there are still many holes that need to be filled. And when we consult the literature, we see two major definitions, and those are here on your screen in black. The first is taking steps toward achieving one's full professional potential. Now, that sounds good, but isn't quite specific enough. So another intervention and definition is the second. Becoming aware of and making choices toward professional well-being and fulfillment. Now, this definition is certainly a step in the right direction, as it's more holistic. It doesn't just think of us as workers or worker bees or professionals, right? But thinks of us more as human beings who have needs and desires that also need to be fulfilled as we work. But there's still something missing. And this area we've identified in red, and this is the area where my research focuses predominantly. And that is how we can begin to identify internal and external obstacles, as well as differentiate systemic from interpersonal experiences. My research is beginning to reveal that when we can sharpen our skills in these areas, we are making bold and great steps toward achieving professional wellness. Let me explain a little bit more about what I mean. Next slide. It started for my colleague and I when we were reading and rereading the work of Toni Morrison. And in her novel called The Bluest Eye, she wrote the following: "Beauty was not something simply to behold. It was something one could do." And as my colleague Dr. Stevens and I meditated on this, we began to see it as not just a definition of what beauty could be, not just a noun and a verb, not just a small piece of a large, beautiful work that Morrison produced in terms of her writing, but also the beginning of a paradigm shift. Next slide. Next, thank you. Beauty is definitely work. It is a product of our work. It is also a process through which we work. And as a communicator, beauty also gives us a vision that tells us about the way things are, as well as about how they could or ought to be. For those reasons, then, beauty represents a shift in work. And this shift is also an acronym. The S stands for success, which, as you and many of my participants have probably already defined it, as setting and achieving our goals. But when we think about this as a shift in how we work, it's also success about living, thriving, and flourishing for an entire career. The H is for health, and that is quite obvious, and I've shared with you a bit of my story in terms of my physical health and well-being. But there are also concerns we would have about how to get treatment, how to invest in our health and our welfare, how to take care of our mental, emotional, and intellectual health, which all play into the health of the organizations in which we find ourselves. So in addition to the nuts and bolts of health from a wellness perspective, as we think about it here at Walden and at Laureate, for example, with our Wellness Challenge, we also need to think about things like health insurance. We also need to think about things like rest, play, and joy, and making room for those as parts of our work. The I is for innovation. And here, of course, we think about technology. We can think about our organization as one that has innovated for the past 50 years. We think of ourselves as members of a distributed workforce that face our own challenges as well as opportunities for growth. The F is for finance, thinking about the money that we make, our savings and retirement, and as something my respondents have shared, is not just about the money we make and being able to save for retirement, but feeling assured that we will be able to retire before age 75 or 80, that we will be able to retire with a sense of security, sufficiency, and sustenance along the way. The T is for tradition. And that can be interpreted in many ways, but we're interpreting it as communication between generations. You can read any major news outlet right now and find talk about millennials and boomers. And these are generations that need to talk more, particularly when it comes to professional development and well-being within organizations. So when we think then about this shift, these ideas of success, health, innovation, finance, and tradition, we can see that this idea of beauty begins to take on a life of its own. But we need to make things a little more concrete. So the question will be, how do we make this shift? And we believe it helps to look for examples. And I'll share the following with you. Next slide. So let's ask some different questions because we want to shift and get some different answers. Take a look at these pictures. Your left is hamburger from In-N-Out. I select them, of course, being from California. The right is an example of an algorithm from Google, also based here in California. And I'd like you to think about this question and then pause for a moment and come up with your answers. What do hamburgers and algorithms have in common? Next slide, please. Now that we've gotten some of those ideas out on the table, I'd like to share where we can go from here and what we can actually find out about beautiful work as it relates to these hamburgers and these algorithms. So let's talk hamburgers, right? When we talk about In-N-Out, when we talk about the hamburgers that they make, right, these are personalized. These are things that invite people in. They provide sustenance for folks, right? And all of this is reflected in the way that In-N-Out operates as an organization. And they are an example of an organization that provides support for work to be beautiful. Let me explain how with some quotations from Glassdoor.com. With a starting rate of $11 an hour, a 401k plan, paid vacation days, and health insurance, In-N-Out associates receive salaries and perks that are well above the industry average. Pair that with strong on-the-job training, opportunities for advancement, people-focused leaders, and a fun, friendly environment. The following comes from the owner of In-N-Out Burger, Lindsay Lavelle Snyder Ellingson. We select leaders who are strong in the area of engagement, in taking great care of our customers and associates with great quality of service. They must also be able to create a team-oriented atmosphere, which is part of our mission statement. Other things like favorable pay structure and flexible scheduling definitely help, but in reality it comes down to our associates being part of something that they take a lot of pride in. I've found that it's hard to argue with an approach that puts your people and their well-being first. The shortest road to a connected team of associates is to lead them as they'd like to be led. Of course, connected and engaged associates do the best work in any organization. We have very high standards, which means we have a lot of procedures and policies in place. But they only work when you have associates who are eager to follow them. So what can we learn from this example? Next slide. We can learn a lot about how to support this shift toward beautiful work. We see here at In-N-Out that there is effective communication, that there is a focus on leadership, that change doesn't just happen, it is explained, that there is creativity allowed for within the system. Many of you In-N-Out aficionados out there might have put down that there is a secret menu at In-N-Out that if you know about, you can go in and order, right? So there is creativity allowed within the system. There are matched goals between customers, associates, and management. Management is listening at all levels of the organization, and there is a focus organizationally in terms of policy and procedure on these 4 items here on the right: adult development, deliberate practice, sincerity, and approachability. So what we're beginning to see through this example is that if we want to make the shift for beautiful work for ourselves and for our organizations and society, we need to begin to focus on these items here. Now, by way of counterpoint, I'll share with you a little more about our algorithms example in the example of Google. Next slide. In November of 2018, Google had its reckoning with the Me Too movement when 20,000 employees walked out in the wake of a New York Times report about Google's handling of sexual misconduct and harassment investigations. Now, the CEO did respond to this protest and said Google's action plan notes a handful of policy changes, including mandatory training for employees, making arbitration options, revamping the claim reporting process, offering career support and/or mental health counseling, and recommitting to equity and inclusion efforts in representation at all levels. Now, for those of us who may be listening on the outside or reading the New York Times, this sounds like a positive start. But for those internal stakeholders, those protesters who walked out, the response was less than stellar. And via Medium, they said the following: our executive's response has ignored several of the core demands we've placed, like elevating the diversity officer and employee representation on the board of directors, and troublingly erased those focused on structural inequity built into the modern-day class system that is separating full-time employees from contract workers in the organization. We can begin to see here that there are some challenges when we are calling for beautiful work within an organization. And those are shared on the next slide. What's happening here? Bad communication. Management and protesters/employees are talking past each other. We're seeing areas of micromanagement as well as areas where there has been no management in terms of these claim and bias reporting processes. We're seeing unexplained change. This is simply a response to a protest, but not a response to a well-drafted statement from the employees. Employees see this as reinventing the wheel, as having goals that are not in line with the goals of the overall organization, and thus have created a space where discrimination can flourish. What does that lead to? That leads to stress on everybody's part, distraction, disengagement, negativity, recidivism, a wake of employees, or I should say a wave of employees has resigned from this organization as a result of management's response here, right? Why? Because there is a lack of agency felt at deep levels within this organization based on what has been shared in the press and these questions and responses from management and employees. So if we think again about this idea of beautiful work, this approach to professional wellness as both a product of work as well as a process or a way of working, if we realize that a shift is needed in terms of success, health, innovation, finance, and tradition, and we can see in two very different organizations two ways in which this shift is and is not happening, we can begin to ask some deeper questions. And those I'll share with you starting on the next slide. What are the challenges to beautiful work for us as faculty, right? When the nature of our job is changing, as we're part of a distributed workforce, as we feel the emotional weight of our students, many of whom are returning to college after a long time, are what we call non-traditional and face very real concerns, oftentimes food insecurity, home insecurity, employment insecurity, and they bring those concerns to us as faculty. How do we deal with data and analytics in the ways in which our classrooms are structured? How do we deal with issues of agency and privacy as a higher education institution when the role of what we do is being questioned writ large from all angles? We see a tweet here on the right side. Could college be a waste of time and money? We see above that from the American Association of University Professors an investigation as to whether student evaluations of teaching are valid. And one of the findings is that they are not. Right? So we've got this overwhelming amount of data coming at us. The nature of our job is changing. The way we deliver our expert knowledge is changing. And these can all pose challenges to how we experience beauty in work and can make those shifts as faculty. Next slide. So How do we deal with all of this? What are some real life things we can do? Well, it starts with asking questions. And my colleague, Dr. Stevens, and I have done just that. So we're going to share with you the questions we've asked, some of the answers we received, and translate for you from what people are saying to what those underlying assumptions about the nature of work are. And then we'll ask you to do the same, and we'll challenge you to answer these questions for yourself. So here's the first. Take a minute to think about this. Pause and write down your answer. What would your work and workplace look like if it were beautiful? When people answered this for us on our survey, they said things like, my work and workplace would be organized and completed, that my work would be authentic, meaningful, and recognized, that it would have a social impact for the good. My workplace would have a clean desk, that there would be open dialogue with my team, that there would be processes in place that are functional, not dysfunctional. I could have more pay and flexibility, that there would be a space where I could learn. And my work and workplace would be spaces where I could do things I love with good people. So that's what people are saying. And we're interested in not just what they're saying, but also in what they mean. And we'll show you that on the next slide. When people say these things, they're telling us that at their core, they want to do work that helps others, that is rewarding financially to themselves and to an organization and to society, that they want to collaborate with others, and they want organizations to do just that, to be organized, to have processes in place that allow for the completion of work that is for the good. Next question. Next slide. How would you answer this? What external and internal obstacles do you see affecting your ability to achieve beauty in your work now or in the future? Pause, take a moment, and answer this question for yourself. When you come back, I'll share with you what people said. People said things like social and competitive obstacles in the marketplace, finances and funding in terms of venture capital and small business funding for those who are entrepreneurs, a great fear of failure, time and time management, knowing how to adjust and adapt, dealing with sexism and racism, way too many meetings, relationship building, knowing when to say no, and organizational politics and agenda. Probably sounds familiar. Let's dig a bit deeper with the next slide and see what that really means. It means that people are struggling with imposter syndrome. Perhaps people don't feel like they have the confidence to do the job set out before them. Others are assuming nostalgia. They are looking back to the way things were. And this has pros and cons, as we discussed when I gave the live webinar session, right? The pros are often that we look back to a simpler time. But that simplicity was often reflected in structural problems for those who did not fit the mold, to times when there were less diversity, equity, and inclusion within our organization. Sometimes this is also nostalgia for times when technology played less of a role in our workplace and communication therein. When people say they're struggling with time, what they're telling us is that they're overwhelmed. And so people are looking for work-life balance. And perhaps we need to challenge ourselves to not look so much for balance, right, but to ask different questions. The article that came out about this recently by Stacey Abrams suggested that instead of looking for work-life balance, we look for work-life Jenga. We think about the pieces and how they're fitting together and what we can remove and reprioritize in order to create more of a sense of beauty in our work. And then emotional offloading. As we've talked about, people needing to recognize the difference between interpersonal and organizational and structural roles within an organization, as well as feeling overwhelmed and overburdened, right? What we're also seeing and hearing is about the issue of emotional offloading. And so we need to figure out, if we're going to talk about how to be well and how to experience and let our work be beautiful, right? We have to think about healthier ways to deal with the challenges that we're facing at work, as well as at home and in our own minds. So we've reviewed what our workplace and work would look like if it were beautiful, what internal and external obstacles we face to meeting those beauty requirements. And now let's think about tools. Next slide. What tools might help make your vision of beautiful work a reality? Pause for a moment and think about it, and when you come back, I'll tell you what others said. People said things like mentorship and career road mapping, more pay and financial guidance, organizational training and professional development, read receipt email capabilities, and more modern communication tools, especially for those in a distributed workforce. Tools like Slack, Yammer, and Zoom, to name a few that were mentioned. Others requested the invention of a new app altogether that would have artificial intelligence involved to create an immersive environment for us to do our work as members of a distributed workforce. Beyond those technological concerns, people also said things like a list of resources like websites, books, podcasts, and personal connections to help me make better decisions. Diversity of thought, life experience, and demographics at all levels of organizations. People said good tools would include tangible steps to figure out how to make a change or a shift toward the vision of beauty that we're talking about. And speaking of those, some said stability of work and shadowing. So what are people really saying when they say those things? Are they saying it's time to quit a job? Are they saying it's time to re-envision their current role within an organization? We'll discuss that on the next slide. So here's what people mean. They mean that they want to be able to identify and deal with micro-practices and behaviors that they observe within their organization. So people are saying that they want to focus on the little things that they feel they can control and then move forward to the bigger things that might at first seem beyond their control. That leads us then to the recognition that we work within systems and structures. Systems and structures that are indeed flawed need to be changed and at some cases reinvented, but nevertheless that we don't work in vacuums. Part of what people are saying here is that we need full equity. We heard this several times already today, most notably in the example shared about the Google walkout, right? That creating equity in a workplace is not just about counting numbers of who's there or saying that we want diversity of thought, right? But rather creating an inclusive environment where communication and concerns can be brought about and addressed. On that note, people are also saying that they need words for their experiences, that they're going through things that they may not be able to fully define and describe yet. So when we ask them these questions, ask them to take a step back and presented them with these ideas about beauty and work and the shift required to begin to get there, right? We found new things being said, new questions being asked, abandoning the search, for example, for work-life balance and looking for a search for work-life Jenga, just to name one. And finally, autonomy, confidence, and belonging, right? Whenever we're in an organization and we want to find our passion, we're looking for these things. And I would add as well, competence, right? So we're looking to feel like we can take a sense of ownership over our work, that we've gotten past these feelings of imposter syndrome, that we belong to an organization that is doing work that is for the positive good, right? And that we also understand our organization, what makes it tick, who does what and why, and under what circumstances, and how can we dissociate personalities from organizational roles. Next slide. So we've got the beginning with some of the answers to these questions and the assumptions upon which they are based of a new paradigm, this Dare to Let Work Be Beautiful paradigm that is modeled for us here by the actress Gina Torres, who has broken many barriers in Hollywood as an Afro-Latina actress. And in interviews and keynote lectures that she gives about her approach, we found it's very much in line with what Dr. Stevens and I have found through our research. And that is that daring to let work be beautiful is based on a few key behaviors. 1, effective communication. 2, identifying and improving upon weaknesses. Right? Too often we are told to find our strengths and keep strengthening them, and that advice is useful but up to a point. When we want to make a change in the structure, we need to be able to identify and improve our own weaknesses as well as those of the organizations and the cultures and societies in which we live. And so this focus on identifying and improving weaknesses plays a greater and greater role. Why? Because it allows us to then consider alternate perspectives on the problems that we face. It allows us to figure out new behaviors and exercises for being good citizens. It allows us to ask different questions that will allow us to filter information accurately and find different purposes and roles in our organizations than we thought might have been there in the beginning. And that's when it gets really exciting. I'll tell you why, starting in the next slide. So why? Because it gives us a moment to reflect, a moment to sit and think about where we want to go based on how that looks on where we are and where we have been. So take a moment, press pause here, and think about where you started in your career, just as I shared with you at the beginning today, and then shared with you a journey about where I've been going. And this shift in terms of where I see myself and the organizations with which I am involved going in the future. Next slide. But you'll say, how do I do that, Marcia? And I'll say, ask yourself some questions like the one we've asked in our survey, right? What would friendship look like if it were beautiful? What would learning look like if it were beautiful? And of course, what would work look like for you if it were beautiful? A true perspective, a true shift toward this beauty in work cannot be found by answering just one of these alone, but by really examining all three. So I challenge you to do that and to see what those reflections yield. Next slide. In the interest of sharing tangible exercises with which we can think through some of these issues and begin to take steps, I offer you these 3. What's one time that made you feel like all your hard work was worth it? Sit down and tell yourself that story, whether you write yourself an email, journal it, record it, and play it back. But think about what happened there, celebrate that, and begin to figure out how you can replicate that. Another way to do this, if you got to throw away one task in your job description, what would it be? What would that task be that you threw away to make your work more beautiful, and why? The third, what is one concept from today's presentation that you would use immediately in your work? Identify that concept, write down 3 ways you could see yourself using immediately, and then use it immediately before the day ends. And write me and tell me what happened. Next slide. So these are some crunchy solutions that we can begin to give you by going inside and also reflecting upon your professional experience and the organizations that you have been involved with, right? Is to begin to identify and distinguish personal, professional, and systemic roles and objectives, and see when in your timeline those have been aligned and when they've been misaligned. And try to think about under what circumstances each of those has been aligned and misaligned. This will reveal for you trends in your professional trajectory, both in terms of your organizations as well as your own roles, responsibilities, and your own thoughts, feelings, and general wellness that you can then use as criteria to make new decisions going forward. Second crunchy solution is to frame professional communication appropriately for the audience, right? So we tell our students this all the time, but we don't always enact it for ourselves. So really think about the needs that our students have and how we can address those appropriately. Think about the needs that our colleagues as fellow faculty have. And then think about the needs that our staff and administration have, and how in our email, in our quest to get requests fulfilled, we can also think about what others need to do their jobs to the best and most beautiful capacity. And third, as we begin to do all this, identify trends, frame our communication appropriately, we then can begin to create ways to transform mistakes into trajectories. And that allows us to provide valuable feedback, as we said earlier, about focusing on weaknesses and how to improve them. Also figuring out how to communicate that in a way that doesn't alienate our students, faculty, staff, administration at all levels of the organization. So I want to thank you for being here with me today, and I want to challenge you to think of your own crunchy solutions and write those down and send me an email at marsha.dawkins@mail.walden.edu. If you'd like to take a look at our survey in terms of our results or even answer it for us, please send me an email. Or if you'd like to share a resource with me or just have a chat, I'm always here and looking forward to connecting. So thank you for taking time out of your